Hello and welcome to the March interview of Psych Soc O'Clock. Today I'm here with Marc Kozlowski, who is an Associate Forensic Psychologist at Edinburgh Napier University. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you for inviting me.
So today we're going to talk about psychopathy, and I was wondering if you had a psychopath that you find most interesting.
Well, there's one who some people don't expect to fit that classification, and it's somebody that we all love and cheer on and celebrate, and that's James Bond.
Okay.
Who, certainly in his original incarnation, the Sean Connery years, was this ruthless killer who used people, murdered people who got in his way without any remorse or any shame or embarrassment, used women for his own ends and left them, and basically, despite all those things, we think he's a hero and we celebrate him and enjoy his escapades, which is quite unusual because he does actually meet most of the criteria for a psychopath.
Oh, that's really interesting, especially because he's so celebrated. He's been reincarnated in quite the same way in all of his different characters, even today.
Yes, although more recently he got a bit maudlin and sad, didn't he, in some of the recent movies. That wouldn't be psychopathic. Right. That's less He's becoming less psychopathic as the movies go on. Right.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. So I was wondering, can you give me a quick summary of your career as a forensic psychologist?
Yes, so I did the route which most people probably do to become a forensic psychologist. I first of all obtained a BPS, British Psychological Society, accredited masters in applied forensic psychology. I then managed to get a job as a forensic psychologist in training in the prison service. And basically what you do is you enter the prison service and you become involved in assessing risk, in treating risk through programmes, and in managing risk, primarily with high-risk offenders, because there's a limited resource of forensic psychologists in the prison service.
Right.
So we tend to get allocated towards the more high-end, serious offenders, because that's the ones that people are most worried about, basically. So I've worked across that time with serious violent offenders, sex offenders, young offenders, female offenders, with different offending backgrounds. And eventually, after you've done your time as a trainee forensic psychologist, you become a chartered forensic psychologist. And I then went on to become head of psychology in 4 different prisons, 2 in England and 2 in Scotland. And over that time, I developed special interests in intimate partner violence, personality disorders, hostage negotiation, and the long-term effects of adverse childhood experiences. And I'm now an Associate Professor in Forensic Psychology at Edinburgh Napier University, and I'm using my work experiences to help the next generation of forensic psychologists to learn their profession, which I'm thoroughly enjoying, and it's a very rewarding thing to be doing.
Were you thrown in the deep end quite immediately in your experience?
Yes. As I say, prison service psychology is under-resourced, I would say, fairly as the standard, as the norm. So therefore, yes, you are put straight in. Obviously, you're never allowed or enabled to work outside your competence. You always have to work within your competence. That's one of the professional and ethical guidelines. However, within that, while you're being supervised by a more experienced chartered psychologist, you will be shown how to do lots of things quite quickly in terms of the actual job itself. And so typically what you would do if you enter the prison service as a trainee is the first thing you'll do is assess people for whether or not they need programs, treatment.
Okay.
And that's a skill in its own right. And actually, although some new trainees think, I'm just being used to assess prisoners for programs, it's actually a key skill. It's a skill that you'll use throughout your career because it's just the same stuff that you'll use. It's the same skills that you'll use when you come to write an in-depth psychological risk profile on somebody later on.
Right.
So it's absolutely valuable training. And because every offender is different, every offender's life story is unique, every offender's offending story is unique, it's different every time. So by definition, it stays interesting.
Yeah.
There's no 2 days the same.
Yeah.
It would be the cliche that some people might use there.
Going more into the psychopathy side of things.
Yeah.
Based on your experience working with convicted offenders,
Yep.
do you think that there are many links between psychopathic and offending behaviours and violent offences?
Okay, so firstly, I think it's important to acknowledge that many people who score high on psychopathy are not in prison or in the criminal justice system at all. Many psychopaths are in normal jobs, living what appear on the surface, at least, to be normal lives. Having said that, we know that there is a concentration of people who score high on psychopathy within the prison population. The evidence tells us that psychopathy is not a necessary condition for violent offending because there are many violent offenders who are not psychopathic, nor is it a sufficient condition for violent offending because some psychopaths do not use physical violence to achieve their goals. However, when you have somebody with a history of violent offending plus a high psychopathy score, then you have somebody who's likely to be resistant to treatment and who is therefore going to pose a high risk of harming others for the foreseeable future.
Because there are some cases, like with James Bond, I suppose, where psychopathy doesn't necessarily result in criminality and people can be quite successful in their lives and their jobs because, in part, of the psychopathic or traits which are considered to be psychopathic. Absolutely.
And indeed, some of the traits are ideal, for example, for becoming a business leader. That kind of ruthless, I'm going to get to the top no matter what, or my company's going to be your company no matter what attitude. In that kind of environment, it actually becomes almost an adaptive trait. However, it's not adaptive in as much as in exercising that trait, it's quite likely that you will create victims of one sort or another, be that financial or people who lose their jobs or so on. So yes, there are situations and environments in which some of the traits are absolutely beneficial and will get you to the top of certain career trees.
So what does the term psychopathy actually mean?
Okay, so in the mainstream media, we see the word psychopath used to describe somebody who's exceptionally violent or who is self-centred or who does things that we don't like or don't understand. So the word psychopath is used to suggest that there is something wrong with this person's behaviour, but without being specific and without providing any explanation, which is not particularly helpful. If we look at an evidence-based definition of psychopathy, one that has been developed over recent years in Scotland by Professor David Cook and his colleagues, we find that a psychopathic person's errant presentation can be evidenced across 6 functional domains. Specifically, a psychopathic person will present with attachment issues, behavioural issues, cognitive issues, dominance issues, emotional issues, and self or identity issues. Professor Cook's analysis helps us to leave behind the informal use of the word psychopath and to look at exactly what it is about the person's thinking, emotions, and behaviours that is problematic. So within the overarching idea of psychopathy, we're able to identify the different and specific ways that psychopathy manifests itself in each individual. And beyond Professor Cook's definition, there have also been a number of other ways of defining psychopathy. And within those definitions, some of the traits that keep coming up are a lack of empathy, a lack of remorse, a lack of emotions, harmful relationships, lying, and irresponsibility. And if you like, I could tell you a bit more about each of those.
Yeah, that would be fantastic.
Okay, if we look more closely then at lack of empathy, psychopaths do not have the neural wiring that is required to experience empathy for another person. There's no mirror neurons.
Okay.
In fact, some neuroimaging studies have found that psychopaths experience pleasure rather than concern when they see somebody else is in pain or distress. And incidentally, while we used to think that increasing an offender's level of empathy would make them less likely to hurt people in the future, we now know that this is not the case, whether the offender is psychopathic or not.
I think I remember perhaps it was R.D. Laing who had a clinic in New York where he tried to treat people to learn how to be more empathetic by having them interact with each other. But once those people were released, they reoffended. And when asked why they reoffended, they said, all we learnt from the therapy was how to pretend we were being empathetic and how to better convince people that we felt regret. And then they were able to use that in their offences, which I thought was really interesting.
That's a really good insight, yes. And there was a period where we thought actually treating psychopaths at all actually made them worse rather than better.
Okay.
But now we're kind of, we've come back a little bit from that and we do our best now. We do, there are various approaches that I can tell you a bit more about later on that have had some successes. They're not big successes, but they are in the right direction. So we've moved on from R.D. Laing's experiences. So the second thing I talked about in terms of signs of psychopathy was a lack of remorse. So looking more closely at that, in the same way that the psychopath's brain does not have the wiring for empathy, there is no emotional mechanism for feeling remorseful either. And this is important to remember when you're working with a psychopathic offender. There is no point expecting them to want to stop hurting people. They enjoy hurting and using people. You need to motivate them by appealing to what they think is a benefit of changing their behaviours. So it's what's in it for them that you have to appeal to, not what's in it for us the people around them.
Does that take quite a long time to understand the individual's motivations and what you can...
They will... they'll become obvious to you quite soon once you start working with somebody like this. All the tools and the techniques and the means of engaging somebody that you'll tend to use as a prison psychologist, you'll notice they're just falling on stony ground with the psychopath. They're just not connecting at all. There's no response. And then if this person has not already been flagged up as scoring on psychopathy, then you may be tempted to think, I wonder if... And that's where you might ask the person to do an assessment and to find out whether there is psychopathy there. And
do you use the David Hare checklist or the other?
It is widely used, and there are a couple of others as well, other tools that are used.
What do you tend to use within your work?
Okay, so probably the most widely used in the UK is Robert Hare's psychopathy checklist, which Robert Hare gave us in 1990. This was a diagnostic tool which enabled clinicians to identify the presence of psychopathy. It's a list of 20 items, and for each item a person can be scored as 0, 1 or 2, depending on how strongly that trait presents in that person. The revised version of this tool, known as the PCL-R, is still widely used by psychologists and psychiatrists in the UK to diagnose psychopathy. There's also a tool called CAP, C-A-P-P, which was devised by David Cook. CAP stands for Comprehensive Assessment of Psychopathic Personality. CAP uses a more nuanced and detailed breakdown of the elements of psychopathy than does the PCL-R, so it gives you more of a profile of what exactly it is about the thoughts, emotions and behaviours of this person that's problematic, as opposed to a score.
Right.
And more recently, Jane and Carol Ireland have developed an assessment tool for psychopathy called Affect, Cognition and Lifestyle Assessment, or ACL, which places less emphasis than the PCL-R does on having a criminal history. So they're kind of saying, because the PCL-R has a couple of items which relate to offending history, and I think the Ireland sisters are trying to get away from that and just say, well, okay, whether they're offended or not, how do we define psychopathy? So a slightly different shift, so it's a slightly different take on the same thing.
And I think I read as well that a lot of the original diagnostic criteria before it was revised was quite male-centric and didn't include a lot of items that would necessarily apply to females. So I wonder, are any of these, are there big changes from...
I'm not aware of a female-specific assessment. And to be honest with you, I'd need to go and check whether the Jane and Carol Islands has been normed on a female population. I'm not sure. But what works against us in that respect, and undoubtedly there is a need for a tool to assess psychopathy in females, there's no question about that. But what works against us is just the tiny numbers of female offenders in prison that we have access to as prison psychologists. So just almost by default, because there are, in England, for example, there are 80,000 males and a few thousand females in prison, most of your work's going to be done with males, which doesn't excuse it, but it does explain why there's less work done with female psychopaths.
There's an interesting question there as well, I guess, whether psychopathy and criminal behaviour is more common in males or whether just the way our society works leads to more men being arrested for the same acts than women. So I suppose it would be interesting if we can get a female diagnostic criteria to compare the differences between which behaviours are most common in female psychopaths and male psychopaths, because I think that would reveal...
Yeah, I mean the work has started to a certain extent because, for example, the HCR20, which is the assessment tool that we use for violence, risk of violence, was developed with and normed on male offenders. However, there's now something called the FAM, which is an add-on assessment tool for the HCR20, which you use if you're working with a female offender. So we are starting to incorporate those assessments for and definitions for females into our work as forensic psychologists. But there isn't, as far as I know, I'm not aware of any psychopathy assessment that's been normed on females yet.
Mm.
Yeah. Okay, so the third trait that I mentioned was a lack of emotions. And to be more accurate, psychopaths have a lack of emotions other than anger.
Okay.
This is quite an extraordinary thing to experience close up when you listen to somebody calmly discussing all manner of unpleasant and shocking things that have happened in their life. You're waiting for the tears, or the angry face, or the embarrassment, or the pained expression, but they don't come. And we know that some psychopaths do learn to fake emotions. They watch what other people say and do in response to certain situations because they understand that society expects people to display certain emotions.
Mm.
They then copy these behaviours in the same way as an actor would. But if you probe them about what they're experiencing, they will be unable to describe the visceral experience of that emotion. It is simply a display of empty gestures and words.
Oh, okay. I guess that's one big difference between psychopathy and actors, because for a while, maybe it was naive, but I wondered, they seem to be doing quite similar things, but I think actors tend to they tend to really try and tap into the emotions, whereas a psychopath wouldn't be able to.
Exactly that. That's a really good distinction, because an actor will train themselves, won't they, to use, to harness how they feel in those when they're experiencing those emotions, and they'll be able to therefore project that to people. But psychopaths don't have that inner resource of like the library of what that feels like to be able to act it out. That's a good point. In terms of harmful relationships, many psychopaths have what is known as glib superficial charm. That is to say that when you meet this person for the first time, you may well come away thinking, oh, he seems like a decent enough chap. But what has actually happened is that you've been taken in by somebody who is very skilled at coming across as likeable, funny, successful, or popular. If you speak to the people who know that person well, however, they are unlikely to use those same adjectives to describe him or her. People who know the psychopath are more likely to describe them as manipulative, callous, uncaring, dishonest, cruel, and self-serving. And that brings us to lying. Psychopaths are expert liars. They are skilled and experienced at spinning yarns on any subject, at inventing personal achievements, at creating entire life stories that bear no relation to reality, and at sidestepping any inconvenient facts or evidence that contradict their stories. And when you do call out a psychopath on a lie, for example, by holding up a photograph of an event that they have just told you never happened, they will display no embarrassment or shame at having been found out to be lying. Rather, they will simply resume their fairy tale version of events as though nothing had happened. The first time you witness this is a jaw-dropping experience.
So they'll continue to deny it happened, or will
Yes.
they? Yeah.
Yes.
And
Even though the evidence is physically in front of them.
Wow.
Yes.
That's crazy.
It is crazy, and it takes some getting used to. And the other thing I mentioned in the list of traits was irresponsibility. And in a psychopath, there are two ways that irresponsibility plays out. Firstly, they're irresponsible in a sense that they will fail to take responsibility for the occasions on which they've hurt somebody else. They will instead find ways to deny having caused distress, or they will minimise the distress they did cause, or they'll attribute blame for the distress to somebody else, often blaming the victim. So examples of this would be the psychopath saying, oh, she's making it up, or he didn't actually need to go to hospital, he was overreacting, or we fought and the knife that he had somehow ended up in his neck, I don't know how it happened, or even though she was crying and screaming, I could tell she was actually enjoying it. So or any of the above and more, you'll hear time and time again from people who score high on psychopathy. The second sort of irresponsibility that's associated with psychopathy is a consistent failure to honour financial and other responsibilities that they have to others. So, for example, a psychopathic person will repeatedly fail to pay bills, will repeatedly fail to pay child maintenance, will be happy living off other people, for example, will repeatedly fail to provide for people who are dependent upon them, and will repeatedly fail to attend appointments with professionals, and will repeatedly fail to observe restrictions that are placed on them, such as no contact orders. Okay.
I guess if you're charming enough to explain that away, then it doesn't necessarily...
Very often they will use that ability to manipulate and to charm and to lie effortlessly to wriggle their way out of various things, at least for a certain amount of time, yes.
When did we start to actually use the term psychopathic?
Okay, so there are many reports of people who we would now refer to as psychopaths throughout written history. Among those who have tried to reach a formal definition, some of the notable psychologists and psychiatrists have included the following. Pinel in 1806 spoke of manie sans délire, which means insanity without delirium. Pritchard later spoke of the morally insane. Koch in 1889 introduced the idea of psychopathic inferiority. This concept was what we would now refer to as personality disorder. Kraepelin in 1907 wrote of the psychopathic personality. In 1941, Karpman distinguished between primary psychopathy and secondary psychopathy. Primary psychopathy is the one that's closest to our current definitions. Also in 1941, Cleckley wrote about the mask of sanity. This captured the idea that psychopaths are able to appear to be normal people living normal lives, but internally they're far from it. And in 1952, psychopathy appeared in the first edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, or DSM, referred to as sociopathic personality disturbance. And the DSM became the go-to manual for diagnosing all types of mental health issues.
I think there's often quite a lot of confusion between psychopathy and sociopathy. But does it tend to be that are sociopaths able to feel emotion?
Okay, so within forensic psychology, certainly within prison service forensic psychology, and I would, based on my experience, I would say within NHS clinical psychology and psychiatry as well, I tend very, very rarely to hear the term sociopath. I think it's used more in the States. And it may have a legal definition there, I don't know, I've not researched that. However, it doesn't have a legal definition here as far as I'm aware.
Okay.
You may occasionally see it referred to in a report, but the vast majority of times you'll see anything referred to, it's psychopathy, it's how psychopathic is it, in what ways is this person psychopathic, does this person meet the diagnostic criteria for psychopathy. Okay. So in the UK, certainly, I see it used very rarely, the word sociopath. Okay. Yeah.
Oh, that's another interesting difference between the different...
Yes, cultural differences, absolutely, yes. Another interesting difference between UK and America is that in the USA, to be classified as a psychopath, you have to score 30 or above on the psychopathy checklist. In the UK, the cut-off point has for a long time been 25.
Okay.
Okay, and that's because in America, more people tend to display more of those traits. And please don't mishear this. I'm not saying that people in America are psychopathic, but they tend to have more of those traits naturally as part of a healthy personality than we do in the UK. So that's an interesting cultural difference there.
Yeah. I guess there's another discussion about individualistic and collectivist countries about whether psychopathic people in more collectivist societies would need an even lower criteria because they wouldn't necessarily normally display as much sort of personal, like, attention yielding behaviours like the glibness and the charm. I think they'd be more often encouraged to fade into the background rather than maybe do those kind of things.
You'll find that a psychopath will struggle to fade into the background anywhere, so therefore they will become more obvious, as you say, in a collectivist type situation. Yes, they'll stand out like a sore thumb. If they're surrounded by people who are trying to help each other and be altruistic, they will stand out like a sore thumb. And yes, so you're right.
And I suppose one of the biggest questions some listeners might have is, as someone who isn't a trained psychologist, if you encounter someone you think might be a psychopath, what should you do, or what should you look out for?
What to look out for? Okay, so about one person in every 100 is in the community meets the diagnostic criteria for psychopathy. These are the psychopaths that you'll come across in your everyday life, as you're asking about. And actually, you can read more about these people in the book Snakes in Suits by Robert Hare. That's a very good book, and you may well recognise a couple of people from your own life when you read that book. Before I list some of the signs of psychopathy, it's important to remember that just because somebody does one or two of the things I'm about to mention, we should not rush to label them as a psychopath. For a diagnosis, we need to see a lot of these things displayed consistently throughout the person's adult lifespan, in all areas of their life, and displayed consistently in every situation. So please don't go around labelling people as psychopaths. Some of the things to look out for are they will always put their needs ahead of everybody else's needs. If you explain to them that other people's needs are as important too, then they'll look at you as if you're dumb or naive. They will happily destroy somebody else's career in order to promote their own career. They will not understand displays of emotion in other people, including fear, sadness, distress, affection, or anxiety. They will never display any emotion other than anger, which you will see if they do not get their way. They will not feel guilty or sorry if they cause somebody else to be hurt or upset. They'll keep you around for as long as you're useful to them. Once you stop being useful to them, they'll discard you. They will do things that seem to other people to be reckless and impulsive, and they will regard acts of altruism and kindness by others as a sign that that person is stupid or weak because they're not putting their own needs first, as we just discussed there with the collectivist situation. They will never take the blame for something going wrong. They will always find somebody else to blame. They will have lots of one-night stands and other brief sexual liaisons. The ideas of commitment and emotional intimacy are like a foreign language to them. And they may have learned to mimic displays of emotion, but those displays will appear fake and will feel unconvincing.
Okay. So I suppose if you know a person very well, then you would be able to tell whether they were a psychopath. Or...
Sometimes it happens that people who have psychopaths in their lives, perhaps in their family or in a social group, it's the things they don't do that you notice first.
Okay.
You notice it because, for example, if somebody doesn't display emotion, that can take a lot longer to spot than somebody actually actively doing something harmful, for example. But over time, you'll start to think, I've never seen her cry, or I've never seen him do this. And it creeps up on you in that respect.
Do you ever have people who bring themselves to be diagnosed or who are suggested by family members for diagnosis?
Okay, so I work in the criminal justice system, so by definition, they've been highlighted either perhaps by their lawyer. It may be they want their client to be assessed for, say, because they'll see that as, well, perhaps that explains why my client committed those offences, for example. Or it may be that a judge in a hearing, criminal hearing, requests an assessment for psychopathy, or the prison service themselves, because if the person, when they become a prisoner, starts to become particularly difficult to manage and disruptive, and effectively we require a lot of resources to try and manage them, and you do require a lot of resources to manage people with psychopathy, just because they drain the staff who work with them. They're very tiring to work with. Then they may request an assessment to say, this person's doing this, and this on a regular basis. Can we have him assessed, please? Whether there's a reason for that. Which
extra provisions would be given? Would it be sort of more trained staff members who know?
Okay, so the way that plays out in prison is that they place extra demands on the staff who work to them. They will typically want to speak to higher members of staff. So, for example, a psychopath may well say something like, yes, I know you're my personal officer and you're here to support me, but I want to speak to the governor because I'm more important than you.
Right.
You're not important enough to help me.
Right.
Or even the Secretary of State, or the First Minister. I don't want to speak to you. And you have that situation. You have them writing to Nicola Sturgeon or the Secretary of State because they think that's the level that they operate at,
right,
and at which they need support.
Well, that's very interesting. It must be difficult to try and support that person if they keep telling you that they're superior to you.
Yes, and one really effective way to annoy a human being is to be disrespectful to them, as I'm sure you know, as we all know. And when that's happening all day, every day, from somebody that you're trying to help, that can become very draining emotionally for people. So we have to support the staff that support these people as well, because it's easy to burn out. And also, another thing that happens with people with difficult personalities in a prison setting is that they will split the staff team around them. So they might play one shift of officers off against another shift, the day shift off against the night shift, for example. Okay. And they'll say to the night shift, yeah, well, they said I could do it. Do you know what I mean? So they're always pushing at the edges of the rules. They're trying to play one staff member off against another. So they might play us as a psychologist off against a nurse, for example, a mental health nurse, or officers off against social workers. But they're always trying to create divisions in the people supporting them, because if people around them are divided and saying and doing different things, then their importance rises, basically, and they're calling the shots, in effect.
And I guess that's another way to continue the manipulation in a setting which is more difficult.
Absolutely. If the team is split, if you've got different staff members with different points of view and saying different things to the person, then really the prisoner is running the show at that point.
So as a psychologist, if you're working with someone and they seem to score very high on the traits or the checklist for psychopathy, what do you then do next?
Okay, so what approach would I take? So firstly, expect a long and challenging therapeutic journey. It's going to be hard work. Secondly, you will only be able to motivate them to complete any intervention by reminding them of how this will benefit them. Nobody else's safety or well-being matters to a psychopath. So you have to sell it to them in terms of, what am I going to get from this? And so it's things like you'll spend less time in prison because you find being in prison frustrating, as opposed to you'll create fewer victims.
Right.
Okay. Expect them to take the credit when you do make some progress, and expect them to blame you when they do not feel they're making progress.
That must be very frustrating.
So they will always be right and you will always be wrong, whatever happens.
Right.
Do not be surprised at how high an opinion they have of themselves. This may be accompanied by them having a low opinion of you, but let that go and keep working away. So let that just drift over your head. And as much as you can, obviously, because we are human and we do respond to having things said to us. But you have to learn to let that go and just keep chipping away, basically, as best you can. Never try to win an argument with a psychopath. They will always need to have the last word. Try to keep them as close to the evidence facts as you can. They will try to steer the conversation off into all manner of fantasies and irrelevancies. Manage down your expectations of treatment outcomes. Any progress that you do make is likely to be slight and to take a long time. But the most important thing, actually, of all of those is to keep yourself healthy. Use your clinical supervisor, counselling, and any other healthy coping strategies that you have to remain positive and calm. Working with a psychopath will take you into some stormy emotional seas, and you need to ensure that you prioritise your own well-being.
Do you have any methods that you use to try and leave your work at work, so that you can enjoy and try not to think too much about the things you've...
It's absolutely crucial to do that. You have to do that. And I've talked to different staff members, not just psychologists, but officers as well, social workers and mental health staff, for example. And everyone has their own technique for doing that. Some people, for example, as they take their uniform off to get changed to go home, talking about an officer here, that maybe as the uniform comes off, so does the job. And they walk out as themselves, as their normal self. That's one way of doing it. Or there may be, on the journey home, you process the last residual thoughts from your working day, so that by the time you arrive at your front drive and walk through the front door, you've left it behind again. It's really key that you do this. And if you don't have healthy things, or people use the gym, for example, to burn off the energy, the same techniques that lots of people can use in any walk of life, whatever works for you. Animals are brilliant. People who have horses and dogs and stuff, and they absolutely immerse themselves, or small children, actually. I used to do that when my children were younger. I used to go home and just become completely immersed in my children's world of toys and fantasies and comics and stuff and drawings, and that is such a different world.
Yes.
You know, that you just your brain just leaves all that other stuff way behind, and you become healthy and positive again. And if you don't take positive steps, then there is a danger that you may well start leaning on unhealthy coping mechanisms, and that doesn't help anybody. It doesn't help you for sure, and it won't help the people around you either, because you're going to become less of an effective worker. And in fact, actually, people who end up looking out for you, because a prison environment, the first priority is always security and safety of everybody,
right?
Staff and prisoners. Keeping people safe is the main thing that we do. And if you're not operating at the best of your ability, if you're operating sub-optimal in some way or another, then you're actually possibly endangering the people around you because you're not looking out for the things that you need to be looking out for.
Right.
So it's in everybody's interest, literally, that everybody's well and healthy.
Right.
in
Are there
prison
quite a
environment.
lot of clinical resources as well? So you will have counsellors maybe that you can talk to, or
Okay,
resources?
in some respects. So, for example, in Scotland, if you're delivering interventions to sex offenders, you will be offered counselling as a matter of course. In fact, you're expected to attend it just to make sure that the stuff that you're hearing and dealing with on a daily basis isn't starting to affect you adversely in some way. And there's lots of reasons, evidence to show that it can do if it's not managed properly. Other times, you will always have your supervisor. If you're a trainee psychologist, you will have your main supervisor and possibly other temporary supervisors as well along the way, alongside that. And I would advise anybody who's becoming a trainee psychologist to make best use of your supervisor, because they'll have been there before. They'll have met people like the people that are causing you problems. They'll have been in situations that are making you feel anxious, and they'll be able to talk you through and keep you calm and explain how to work through that in a healthy way.
Right.
It's really key that you do that, because we are around people. The people that we deal with in prison are some of the most damaged people, as well as being dangerous, and difficult as well.
Yeah.
So all those three, that's some combination to work with. And if you're working with that sort of person all day, every day, 5 days a week, then it's bound to have an effect, and it's going to take a toll. You're going to get ground down, you're going to get annoyed, you're going to get frustrated, you're going to perhaps get upset. But there are ways to deal with all that, healthy ways to deal with all that. So just make use of all the support you can get.
Can you give me any examples of people you've worked with who have scored highly on psychopathy, and how did that manifest in their behaviours?
Okay. Well, so one person who comes to mind, I once worked with a man who had paid somebody to murder his wife.
Wow.
And he remained convinced that because he'd not physically murdered the victim himself, he could not be held responsible for her death, and therefore did not pose a risk to women.
Right.
He also used to complain that the hired killer was released from prison several years before he was, which he regarded as being the wrong way round.
Right.
And one of the obvious challenges in that case was to convince the man to engage in treatment at all.
Right.
Because as far as he was concerned, he'd been wronged by society.
So I assume that was incredibly difficult to try and even convince him that...
He was fairly entrenched in those views, yes. It took a lot of work. He had to be smart. And like I said in answer to a previous question around treatment, you have to set quite modest treatment targets. You're not going to make a big difference here. You can make small differences, and it's worth... And I stress it's worth making those small differences, because any bit more safe we can make them, that's worth it. So, but yes, you're going to make. We made small differences, but there was a lot of challenges, and the people who worked with him all got very tired and frustrated. Yes.
I suppose it must be in some way satisfying for someone with those traits to be able to run down staff members in that way, but very difficult for the treatment, because you'll have to reintroduce that person's behaviours to new people over and over again.
Yes, absolutely. Each time they meet somebody new, you have to go through that process again of them realising this is just how he works, this is who he is. Yes, absolutely. And one of the things you'll find with people who do score high on psychopathy is if you have them in a treatment group, so typically in a prison offending behaviour treatment group, you'll have 8 prisoners and 2 members of staff, 2 facilitators. And if one of the 8 prisoners or offenders in that group scores high on psychopathy, then you can bet your bottom dollar that they're going to see themselves as the 3rd facilitator.
Right.
They're going to take that role and explain to their colleagues what's going on, to their fellow prisoners what's going on the whole time, rather than being a participant.
Wow, that must be incredibly difficult.
You can use that to your advantage at times.
Okay.
Once you get the hang of how that works, you can actually almost harness that slightly to a certain extent, but you wouldn't want to do that cynically or using subterfuge or anything like that. You use it appropriately and occasionally.
It
just
sounds
just
like
to
there's
reinforce
a lot
the
of
point.
mental gymnastics that you have to do all the time.
Yeah. The thing actually is that the more transparent, honest and consistent we can be as staff members, the the more likely we are to be effective in making some difference with the people that we're working with. And don't forget that in that same group, there are 7 other prisoners who we also want to treat. And just because one person's dominating and taking that third facilitator role, we mustn't let that detract from the experience of the other 7, and we have to have those other 7 in mind. So we maintain as much consistency and transparency in what we're doing as we can. So as I said, you can occasionally just tap into the fact that he's going to be the third facilitator and almost allow him to reinforce what you've just said.
Right.
You know, where it's appropriate. But a lot of the time it can just be frustrating.
Yes.
And another example, you asked about examples of clients I've worked with. And this is another example of how that can play out in that work environment for a forensic psychologist. We had, I was managing an offending behaviour programs team in a prison. We were allocating prisoners to 2 programs that were due to start soon, and that would run concurrently, so they're going to be running at the same time alongside one another. Among our pool of 16 participants, 8 for each group, we had 2 men who scored high on psychopathy, say Mr. X and Mr. Y. And we deliberately allocated one of these high psychopathy scorers to each group so that we did not have to have managed 2 psychopaths in one group.
Same group, yeah.
And because we knew from experience how much high psychopathy scorers like to dominate a therapeutic group, we agreed among ourselves that we would, in no circumstances, end up referring to these groups as Mr. X's group and Mr. Y's group, which is exactly what Mr. X and Mr. Y would have liked us to call the groups. Sadly and astonishingly, within about 4 weeks, we had all started to refer to the groups as Mr. X's group and Mr. Y's group, and we were all experienced practitioners. So that's just how powerful psychopathic personalities can be. And
they manipulate the whole therapeutic group.
They become the centre of everybody's attention. Yeah.
I can't imagine what it would have been like to have both people in the same group.
That's why we avoided that.
Yes,
because that's unthinkable.
Yeah. So going back to if there is a colleague or a boss or partner or family member that you believe to have psychopathic traits, what would you recommend for people to do? Okay,
so the crucial thing is to keep yourself safe, for the reasons that I alluded to previously. So in a work situation, ensure that you keep emails, keep recordings, keep documents such as minutes of meetings, which evidence exactly what was said by whom and when. Because without evidence to support you, you're likely to be trampled underfoot by a psychopathic colleague or boss who will accuse you of lying or of being incompetent. You'll be blamed for all of their failures and they will take all of the credit for your good work.
Right.
In a couple situation, my honest advice would be to get out of that relationship. If, for whatever reason, you're unable to leave the relationship, then make sure that other people know every time that your partner threatens you, stops you from seeing your friends and family, or controls you in other ways. The more people who know about your partner's abusive behaviour, the less likely you are to be seriously harmed. And in any situation, do not expect the person to change. Sometimes people feel that they want to be the one to save the person and help them to change their ways. I can turn him round, I can make him think and behave the way we do. But if they do score high on psychopathy, then you will fail. And in the process of trying to change them, you may make yourself unwell or even unsafe. So that's why I come back to my first piece of advice, which is keep yourself safe.
What do we know, especially thinking about family members who may be psychopathic, what do we know about the causes of psychopathy?
Okay, so as Oscar Wilde astutely observed, the truth is rarely pure and never simple, and that's as true here as it is anywhere else in forensic psychology. I use that quote a lot because it seems to apply to so many different areas of forensic psychology. It is, as I say, rarely pure and never simple. So forensic psychologists take a biopsychosocial approach to understanding where psychopathy comes from. That is to say that we acknowledge that somebody may be born with a biological predisposition to psychopathy, and we acknowledge that extreme childhood adversity or some other combination of childhood experiences can play a part in leaving somebody with a psychopathic personality. So, for example, the man I referred to previously who paid somebody to kill his wife, once you start working with him, we established actually his childhood had been absolutely hellish. He just had experienced things that no child should ever have to experience, and it left him that damaged, basically. So that we look at both sides of that. We're learning more every year about the differences that we see in the brains of people who score high on psychopathy. Blair, Mitchell and Blair have much to offer here, and many others as well. In fact, it's Blair, Mitchell and Blair was the go-to reference for the brain aspects of psychopathy a few years ago, but it's moving so fast now that that's almost become like an outdated text already. Right. Which is a good thing. Yeah. That's good that we're moving that fast. I get the sense that the advances in understanding that we're currently making through fMRI and other approaches, in tandem with our increased understanding of the long-term effects of adverse childhood experiences, are hopefully edging us ever closer to a satisfactory explanation for the etiology of psychopathy.
I think, isn't there as well an age before which you can't diagnose someone as a psychopath?
Yes, that's true of any personality disorder, actually. Or certainly with the most personality disorder examination, you will need the person to have displayed it as an adult, which means 18 and above, for at least 5 years. Okay. So that means the minimum age you can assess somebody is 23. Right. And even then, to be fair, because you're still effectively there, you're still in your adolescence at 23, and we do see people who mature, say, late 20s, early 30s, either because their life situation changes, and they may get jobs, they may get partners, they may get children who make them change their priorities, or it may just be a maturation process, internal anyway, that as you live more life, you change slightly in how you approach life. So even at 23, I would say, use it with caution, because it may well be that person is still developing. Right. They're still they haven't arrived yet at their full adult personality. So always have that in mind, basically. But yes, you're right. Prior to 18, you wouldn't even mention it. Right. Yeah. And I guess looking at that, what kind of treatment options are there? Because if someone was, say, 23 or 18 even, and displaying some of these traits, that may be an opportunity to try and help them develop behaviours which would be better for their future. Yeah, you absolutely use as many resources as you can to help them to address the problematic behaviours, because that's how you'd have to see it. You wouldn't mention the word psychopathy for somebody, for example, who's 17. However much it looked like psychopathy, what they were doing, you wouldn't use the word. What you would do is you would list the traits that are causing the issues. So what is it about his thinking that makes him do those things that hurt people? What is it about his behaviours that's problematic? What is it about his emotional life that's problematic? And look at those individual traits and address those individually, one at a time per person, without mentioning a diagnostic label, because the reason for that is that diagnostic labels stick. Once there's a report written somewhere and a psychiatrist or a psychologist says, I think this person meets the diagnostic criteria for such and such personality disorder, which could be psychopathy as well, that will stick. People remember that for the rest of that person's adult life. It will stick with them, and they'll stop seeing the person and they can just see the label. And that doesn't help at all, because it's the person that we need to treat, not the label. I guess in that way the PCL-R is slightly less useful in the way it just gives a score, rather than the other system you were talking about, which can help identify those individual behaviours and traits in a more... Yes, that's true. I mean, to be fair to the PCL-R, it does give you some profile. It gives you areas in which the problems emerge. But the other tools are specifically designed to be more subtle and more nuanced about that, so that we can be more specific about what we target. Exactly what situation and exactly what thoughts or thinking styles does the person have which cause the problems, as opposed to just saying he has thinking style problems, for example. Right. The more specific we can be, the better we can treat them. And I guess in that way, there seems to be like there's a continuum of psychopathic behaviours depending on the situations, or rather than just a dead set. That's a really good question. And I'm going to give the best answer I can. I'm a little fearful to provide a simple answer to this, to be honest, in case I provoke outrage and abusive emails from my colleagues who adhere to a different model. But broadly speaking, I would say some psychologists and psychiatrists adhere to a categorical diagnosis. So is he or isn't he, yes or no, binary type situation. So, for example, if somebody scores 30 or above on Hare's psychopathy checklist, then those clinicians would regard the individual as meeting the diagnostic criteria for psychopathy. Other researchers and practitioners prefer to use a profile approach. And as I say, by this I mean that rather than having a scaled score of symptomology, we seek to build a more complex and subtle profile of how psychopathy manifests itself in each individual. What are the exact thoughts, feelings and behaviours that create problems for the individual or for those people around the individual? And in my experience as a forensic psychology practitioner, I would say that courts and parole boards prefer to work with a categorical diagnosis, is he or isn't he, whereas those providing treatment and risk management for the individual are probably more helpfully informed by the profile approach.
Right.
Okay. And I hope that I provided a helpful answer without offending my colleagues.
Are there any treatments for psychopathy aside from just for children and young people?
Sure. So it's not possible to treat a personality in the same way that you can treat a mental illness or a physical illness. The person is who the person is. We don't prescribe medicines for specific personality types. What we can do, if the psychopathy is resulting in harm to the person or resulting in harm to those around the person, is encourage that individual to develop, firstly, insight into how they think, feel and behave. So they need to realise how they're coming across and what they're doing to people. And secondly, strategies for managing how they think, feel and behave in a certain way. So it's about insight and strategies rather than treatment as such. So effectively we're supporting them to manage themselves more safely.
Right.
You need to remember that many psychopathic individuals believe that they are right and everyone else is wrong or stupid or gullible. And if I believe that I'm right and living my life in a way that makes me feel good, then why would I want to listen to you as a psychologist telling me that to live my life in a different way? What's in it for me? The good news is that serious offenders who have high psychopathy scores can be and are helped to learn how to manage themselves more safely, to an extent at least.
Okay.
For example, prisoners in England and Wales can access specialist units for working with difficult personalities. They can access something called PD pathways, which provides support for offenders with challenging personalities, both in custody and beyond. And they can access therapeutic communities, which are prison-based units in which the prisoners themselves take on much of the day-to-day running. And all of those approaches have evidenced successes in helping people who we thought were untreatable to develop insights and strategies to manage themselves safely. Sadly, there are currently no equivalent services available in Scotland.
Right. Oh well, that's a hopeful note to end on, and hopefully we can keep bringing those useful treatments to Scotland and see how we can help people with psychopathy and those who are experiencing their behaviour.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
I hope that you have a restful week and don't have to deal with too many difficult psychopathic people in your work.
Thank you very much. You too.
The Psych Soc O'Clock podcast was created by Amelia Hilton in association with the Glasgow University Psychology Society. This conversation was recorded by Amelia Hilton and Professor Marc Kozlowski. It was produced by Amelia Hilton and edited by Jack Harding, with original music by Jack Harding, and it was recorded in the University of Glasgow School of Psychology and Neuroscience Faculty's Speech Lab.